Enjoy this Wild Soul Gathering production. I'm Dr. Sandra Marie. Pour yourself a really tall glass of spiritual curiosity and join me for the Happy Hour for the Spiritually Curious podcast. In the spirit of happy hour, cheers to some new insights, peace, revitalization, and perhaps an aha moment that may change your life. Welcome to Happy Hour for the Spiritually Curious. This is Dr. Sandra Marie. Today I'll be talking with Kat Lee from Empowered Curiosity. Kat is a spiritual business mentor, Taoist, and podcast host. Welcome to the show, Kat.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here.
I'm very excited to have you here today. I would like to talk about business, spiritual business.
Yeah.
Myself coming from the corporate world in healthcare, the concept of spiritual business and business being a spiritual practice truly piqued my curiosity. I feel my personal experiences in the corporate world did not feel very spiritual most of the time, to be very honest with you. I would love to hear about being a spiritual business coach, business and emotional alchemy, conscious marketing.
Mm-hmm.
You had your own journey in healthcare that shifted you, I believe, onto this path where you really wanted to reclaim the parts of medicine that your soul just couldn't live without.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. When we had our little let's feel each other out sort of call, I felt like I had met like a kindred spirit in you. So excited to come hang out with you on your podcast. I guess the best place to start is to kind of explain what I mean by business as a spiritual practice, and then I can sort of backtrack and share a little bit about my history and how I got there. You don't have to have a business that's around woo-woo things to have a spiritual business. I have clients who are accountants, who are lawyers, these more like logical practices. But the thing that I have found over my years of being an entrepreneur is there's these sticky places that my spirit wants to hang out in. You know, I've worked through so many of my sticky places through my relationships, through my spiritual practice, through even just being in relationship with myself. And I found that business has a way of activating those sticky places. And so, for example, I thought I had worked through a lot of my attachment issues. I tend to be a little bit more anxiously attached. For those of you who understand that terminology, what that looks like is if there's a conflict in my relationship, particularly my romantic relationships, I really want to like fix it right there in that moment. I have trouble giving it space to breathe. I have trouble not having all the answers. I'm a bit of a doer. You know, I had worked through so much of that through my really wonderful partnerships. Then I found myself in business kind of feeling the same way and having those activation points showing up again, not necessarily acting on them because it would have been unprofessional, but that same feeling of like, oh, I wonder why that person I had a sales call with never contacted me back. I wonder if that patient is doing okay and I need to go and make sure that they're okay, and like almost being a little bit hovery. I found that instead of denying those parts of myself, what would happen if I actually started leaning into those sticky places in my business? And as I started doing that, I started sharing it online on Instagram and found that there were lots of other entrepreneurs who felt the same way. My business as a spiritual entrepreneur mentor has kind of evolved organically. It wasn't something that I set out to do. It was something that people were starting to ask, how are you communicating with people? How are you showing up on Instagram in this way? How are you writing about these really tender places? I don't feel like I can show up as authentically as you in my marketing. And so took on a couple clients here and there, and now it's a full-fledged program. That's kind of what I mean by business as a spiritual practice, is business being the portal to do a lot of this really sticky work that we as humans encounter all the time. I'm just going to pause there and see if there's anything in there that you feel like you want to poke at.
No, I love that. There's a couple of things, self-awareness and that relationship with self. I think a lot of the focus is always on the external. So we focus a lot on our relationships outside of ourselves, but our relationship with ourselves is very important and meaningful, right? The other thing that was fascinating as you were speaking, I was just giggling inside about how it found you.
Absolutely.
You didn't go looking for this. You put it out there, and organically, it all just came to you. And now you're on this incredibly beautiful path.
Yeah. Thanks for noting that. I feel like, and I can go into a little bit of my history here, all the things that I've been trying to do in my previous careers, notably acupuncture, I was an acupuncturist in a past life. I feel like I'm able to bring all of that into my spiritual business mentorship practice. My path has been quite meandery. I used to be a vet tech. I used to manage restaurants. I used to be a bartender, dog walker. And then my longest stint as a career was as an acupuncturist. What I found is that I fell in love with the Taoist medicine tradition, but didn't love how this beautiful esoteric medicine was kind of shoved into a Western medicine box. Instead of being able to look at and truly look at the pieces of mind, body, and spirit as being like a whole unit, even in traditional Chinese medicine, what they do is they basically pare it down to a bunch of signs and symptoms. And then here's a cookbook of all the points that you would use and all the herbs that you would use. And there's not a ton of discussion around, hey, is there something coming up in your life, a part of your body saying, I'm not fully integrated around this? I started organically working with my own patients in my acupuncture practice. And instead of looking at signs and symptoms as things that we need to shut down and silence and mask over, I started thinking of them as communication from the body. The body really doesn't have a ton of language, but the pieces of language it does have is physical sensation and pain. And so if you don't pay attention to the body at the level of physical sensation, of like, ooh, there's a fluttering in my chest and that doesn't feel quite right, then the body's going to start speaking louder and louder and louder and louder. Not to say that all disease processes are coming from some sort of unresolved trauma or some sort of misalignment in someone's life, but certainly stress is such a huge component in a lot of disease processes. I got a little bit burnt out doing Eastern medicine in a Western medicine framework. I was a fertility acupuncturist for a while. I worked right alongside doctors and just started to see how this medicine was so removed from the original intention of the founders of the medicine. Luckily, we still have access to these classical Taoist texts, and I started doing a lot of reading and a lot of just studying on my own. When the pandemic hit, I didn't realize that that was going to be my aha moment. As we started talking about, it's time to start going back to the clinic, my body was in a complete not happening sort of state. And that's when I started up my coaching practice. And I find now that actually I'm able to practice Taoist medicine in a more pure form, ironically, as a business coach than I ever was as an acupuncturist. Because one of the core tenets of Taoism is you are born into this life as this really pure, beautiful being. And over the course of your life, you had to survive your family. You had to live within a community. You had to live within a cultural context. And so we layer on all these conditions and ways of being in order to be accepted and to belong in our communities. It pulls us away from that beautiful core, pure sense of who you were when you were first born. With a lot of my clients, what I'm actually helping them do, I feel a little bit like I'm Trojan horsing them because I'm talking about business, but what I'm actually helping them do is like, can we release all these layers of conditions that you've needed to survive? And so we're not going to make those parts of you wrong, but it's maybe time to examine those parts of you and ask, is it maybe time to let them go? And can we do that in a way that's really respectful and integrative instead of further fracturing? Yeah, that's kind of like my long-winded biography.
It's beautiful, and I love how you incorporated it all because we do tend to compartmentalize in our life. I know when we first had talked, and I agree with you, it was an amazing, lovely conversation, definitely kindred spirits. When we talked about when we first got into this with our day jobs, where we really compartmentalized these spiritual journeys and what we're doing now to what it was initially when we were in the business, or kept it separate because it felt like it should be separate. It wouldn't necessarily be looked upon in a positive way. The stress thing, I love how you spoke the words with the body and stress and medicine, because it does overlap. It plays into everything. We can want to think that it doesn't. It may be easier in the short term to deal with that. But when we start looking at everything as a whole, I think that it takes us down a much more comfortable, lovelier path. I love that you brought up about being a Taoist. I'm going to guess that many of the listeners have never heard of the Tao. Can you just give a little... You actually did give information on it and spoke to it. But I mean, I would say that most people hadn't heard of it. And I think I shared with you that I listened to the book, I think it was back in 2018, and I was really fascinated, and I never really had heard about it. And honestly, until I met you, you're the first person that I have met that practices it. If you can just give a little 101 about what it is, and if folks want to look more into it, some resources for it.
A little elevator speech for my spiritual practice.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the resources, because there's two main texts that I would say most people would want to begin with. The first is the Tao Te Ching. And actually, I'm reading through a really lovely translation of it right now. The author has made it into a comic book. The drawings are really fun and it makes it like really tangible, but then also the translation is quite good. So that would be a good one for folks to start with. And then the I Ching is the other one. And my favorite version of the I Ching is Ursula Le Guin's translation. Where do I start? I ultimately think about my practice as being a constant question of how can I be in relationship with nature? When we think about the ways in which our modern culture has maybe gone a bit sideways, it's because we're no longer living in alignment with the cycles of nature. Even if I can relate it back to an experience that you might be familiar with of being in the Western medical system, right? And, I know that culture has a lot of tendency for burnout. People are asked to work a lot more than they really should. They're asked to give a lot. We tend to live in a culture where we romanticize the overgiving aspects of our personalities. And for many of us as loving, giving people who go into the healing arts and maybe go into the Western medicine side of healing arts, that part of us gets exploited. When I think about how nature is, it's in complete contradiction to that, right? Like right now, I'm looking out my window. It's a beautiful early March, but it's a beautiful winter day, and like the snow is falling, and it makes me feel like I want to be cozy inside. We're all meant to go through these cycles of rest and activity. The more we're able to give ourselves that permission to rest, then it sort of feeds our ability to do activity in a mindful and intentional way. To me, that's kind of where it all begins is, I feel like there's some sort of misalignment with something in my life. Then I start to look at my life as a metaphor, and if my life were nature, what's going out of balance? So that's a piece of it. A big piece of it that isn't necessarily talked about in the text, but I think is a really important thing, is the somatic work and really understanding these messages that our body is giving us and not overriding them and not making them wrong and not denying them, but actually giving them a space to speak is a big part of it. And then another part of it is that piece that I just spoke of, which is, can we allow ourselves to slough off these layers of conditions? And really that only happens in safety, right? The reason why those conditions are there is because it protected you from some form of threat. In order to give yourself the ability to even think about releasing some of those survival tactics, we have to go back and allow yourself to ask these questions around, how can I feel safe? How can I feel grounded in this moment? And then from that space of safety and groundedness, is this tactic really appropriate? Is this tactic really necessary? Yeah, I think that that interweaves its way through every aspect of my life. And I thought that for the longest time, I had to keep those parts of myself separate. Like I could do that in my personal relationships. I could do that when I'm on a hike in the woods, but that has no place in my work life because my work life was asking me to overgive and overdo. If I didn't, then I was penalized for it. Now I feel like I'm able to interweave all those pieces together. And my hope is that by inspiring other spiritual entrepreneurs to do the same, we're able to, I don't know, shift the tide in our own way around these toxic practices around business and capitalism and manipulation and coercion and extraction.
It's so timely, and I think you hit the nail on the head, certainly with healthcare, but it's not unique to healthcare. Obviously, healthcare is in huge turmoil and chaos and the whole workforce issue, and there's workforce issues everywhere. And I shared with you, I felt like they're missing the boat on why everyone's leaving and what we need to do to resolve it. They frame it from a business perspective, but it really doesn't come from the worker side of it. You just summed it up really nicely and talked about business decisions many times just dehumanize clients. And then you have that loss of personal relationship, and all business is personal relationship on some level, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's either you lose that relationship or the relationship doesn't get designed correctly. When you talked about spiritual entrepreneurship, you talked about it being a subtractive process to get back to who you were. When we were talking about those things, you brought up nervous system regulation. That was very significant to you. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, it is like, oh, like I can just nerd out about the nervous system for like ever. Like, how long do you have on this podcast, girl?
I know, it was fascinating listening to you, and I'm so excited to like just plant a seed or grow this seed with the listeners.
So I think so much of it goes back to the nervous system. If anybody is interested in this kind of work, I haven't finished the book yet, but it is, I feel like it's going to be one of the most important books I read in my life. Gabor Mate, who is, oh my gosh, on the forefront of trauma work right now, and his son Daniel Mate, they wrote a book called The Myth of Normal. It is a tome of a book and it's so dense, but I feel like they have so eloquently summarized so many of the things that I've been kind of piecing together by reading so many different books. And I feel like they've been doing the same thing. The short of it is that our nervous system drives unconsciously, consciously, most of the decisions in our lives. It ultimately comes down to this question of, do I feel safe? If you feel safe, then your nervous system turns on the parasympathetic side of its mode, which is commonly known as the rest digest side. I also like to put in breed and feed on that side as well. If you don't feel safe, then your body switches on into the sympathetic part of the nervous system, which is the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn part of the nervous system. I think it's worth talking about the sympathetic part because I think that's where a lot of people are going to be able to relate to is when you don't feel safe. Think about the things that you do in order to feel like you feel safe again. And it's not always about like, oh man, there's a scary person that's chasing me down the street or there's a bear coming after me. Sometimes it's, ooh, that person said something to me and it just landed pretty tenderly. Am I going to run away from that? Am I going to just agree with them, which is the fawn part? Am I going to get really defensive and fight them on it? And depending on how we were raised, depending on your constitutional makeup, depending on your family structure, you likely took on one or two of these strategies as a way to survive your life. To me, when I see anybody who is reacting versus responding, my immediate question is, oh, I wonder why they don't feel safe. What needs to happen for this person to feel safe in this environment? If we loop it back to business, oh man, so many ways in which we do fight, flight, freeze, or fawn in business. If you are somebody who fawns easily, maybe you're so worried about how to price things because you're worried that, people are not going to be able to pay for your services. And so then you end up pricing yourself too low, which then means that you don't feel nourished in your business. There's so much fight in the like social media space right now where people are getting really dogmatic about what they believe, how they practice, what they do. There's no room for even discussion of like, maybe we can do things a little bit better. In the flight response or the freeze response, they kind of overlap a little bit, which is why I put them together. You know, a lot of people think that they're lazy and they're procrastinators, think that there's something wrong with them when they can't put out this marketing thing, or they can't seem to just do the thing that they learned in their business course. To me, it's like, oh, actually, your nervous system's in a shutdown mode because you don't feel safe. And so what we need to do is go back and understand where that story came from so that we can help you release that story. And then the to-do things with your business are actually quite simple. And that's the thing that I found coaching people through business is the majority of the heavy lifting is spent in this space where we're exploring, where do you not feel safe? How can we help you get back into alignment? And from that place, how can we help you find those values and ethics that your business stands on? And then the to-do stuff is so easy. A lot of people come into my programs thinking, oh my gosh, there must be something wrong with me because I've taken every single program out there and I feel just overwhelmed. And it's like, if I were to give you another tool at that state of overwhelm, it would just drive you further into a freeze state. When we talk about the parasympathetic arm of the nervous system, that's where that creative flow comes through. I imagine when you were dreaming up your podcast, that came from a place where your body was like, oh, I need to do this. And it might have felt a little bit scary, but ultimately that creative flow was wanting to come through because you felt safe and you were in that parasympathetic state. I run a podcast too. You go through multiple stages of like, oh my gosh, I'm so nervous, and then come back into regulation again. And it's not about making the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn part of you wrong. It's about how can we help you cultivate a flexible nervous system so that you are responding to whatever threat is happening around you, because we have threats happening around us all the time. How can you respond to that threat in an appropriate way instead of in a way where you've projected an old story about your parents or an old story about a past teacher or an ex-partner? I feel like that's like dipping the toe in there.
This makes so much sense. It's like taking down the barriers within ourselves to find out how it's all connected and where it comes from. We can approach it in a different way. You talked about getting back to your intuition. People have lost the ability to get back to their intuition, or they've lost that tool.
Yeah. To me, again, this goes back to the body. I have given up my acupuncture practice, but the thing that I'm so grateful for with my acupuncture practice is that I got to be with, touch, feel so many different bodies, feel them in all their different energetic states. This piece, especially around intuition, I feel like is rooted in your ability to actually feel your body, because when there's that feedback loop of your body giving you messages and you listening, you know, we sort of talked about it in the sense of like physical sensations that if you don't listen to them, they turn into pain, and then that might turn into a disease process. But the same is true on the opposite side, is your body is sending you signals of like, yes, all the time. I want to do this all the time. A lot of times, because of those conditions and because of these quote unquote responsibilities we have in our modern culture, we deny ourselves that yes feeling as well. When I think about my intuition, I think about how clearly am I able to like listen to those whispers of yes and no coming from my body. And I've made some weird decisions in my life. A lot of them revolve around my business. A lot of them are personal. When my intuition was leading me, it's never strayed me wrong, you know? And then I think the next part of that question is, how can you discern between intuition and fear, perhaps? I've found over the years, the difference there is like fear has a lot of story. Like you might feel like, oh, this is like an intuitive hit, but then there's like, whoop, I'm up in my head and I'm thinking about all the consequences. I'm thinking about all the how-tos. I'm thinking about la, 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 la. When it's intuition, it's a pretty quiet experience. And it's sometimes a stillness that's like, I don't know why I have to do this, but I have to do this. And there's not a ton of story around it. Yeah. I'm curious about, I've shared so much about my life. What is your experience of intuition?
Actually, when you were speaking about the intuition and you brought up the podcast that I felt like I needed to do, but I was terrified because I had no skill set to do it. It was there, it didn't let go, and I went with it. And I've even reached out to a few people who were very kind to assist me and get me to the jump off point, and went from a lot of anxiety and fear to, I love it. It's interesting. I mean, every show I get a little anxious and, how's this going to go? Basically, I'm an introvert and I'm doing this podcast and meeting all these people, initiating these conversations, just really growing so much spiritually myself and as a human being through the process, I'll say, of having to do it. I'm really trying to watch my words, but of the experience, the gift of doing this, it has been just delightful. And if I had not followed my intuitive hit on this and just stuck with my mental part of it, honestly, I don't believe this would be happening, to be honest with you.
And that's that piece, that co-creative energy with a project that I think is just such a fascinating energy to play with. I really think that's kind of what I'm playing with in my business. I think about my business as being an actual entity who's got some thoughts and feelings about how it wants to show up in the world. It sounds like you've had a very similar relationship of, oh, this is like an intuitive hit that just won't let me go. It feels like it needs to come through me. To me, it's like when you get those intuitive hits, it's like you're in the parasympathetic. And then, of course, because then you start thinking about, oh my gosh, which mic do I need to buy? Which program do I need to use? Which platform do I need to invest in? Then you get sort of pushed up into your sympathetic again, right? But what I love about projects like this is there's this space in between that I call nervous-sided. To me, that's everyone's growth edge, is when you are standing in that space where you're like, I am so nervous-sided about this. Because if you were just excited about it, you're still in your comfort zone, right? It's a full body. Yes, it's fantastic. It's exciting, but it's still in your comfort zone versus if you're just nervous about it, it's too far out of your comfort zone for it to be a learning experience, right? When you're standing in that space, it's like, to use the terminology here, they call it the window of tolerance. You're stretching your window of tolerance of what used to be unsafe, and you're pushing the edges of it so that it is now going to be part of your program of this is safe. For you with the podcast, it's a good experience that you feel a little bit excited, anxious, nervous, inspired before each episode, because what you're talking about is that growth edge.
I love that word, nervous-sided. How did you say it? Nervous, excited.
Nervous-sided. I actually stole it from a client of mine.
Okay, well, fair enough. But I think that Daniel Webster needs to put it in the dictionary because it has huge meaning. I love it. So tell me about your podcast. Do share.
Podcast is called the Empowered Curiosity Podcast. It is for spiritual entrepreneurs. If this conversation that I'm having with you here on the happy hour is piquing your curiosity, then I would just go check that out. I think we're reaching 100 episodes this month.
Oh, wow. That's impressive.
We talk about everything from conscious marketing. We've been keeping it going since 2020. We have everything from conscious marketing to ethical business practices to boundaries and relationships with your clients. We just cover all the things that a spiritual entrepreneur would want to get their hands on. Yeah, it's a fun resource.
Nice. Can you talk a little bit about some of the specific offerings that you offer? Is it one-on-one stuff? Do you have courses?
I don't do one-on-one work anymore. I have lots of different ways to play, ranging from completely free up to my bigger investments. On the free end, we've got the podcast. I also have a monthly full moon call for anybody who's interested in Taoism. And so this isn't actually about spiritual entrepreneurship at all. It's just about folks who want to understand the Tao a little bit more. I run that call on Instagram.
Well, you have me at full moon.
Yeah, do it every full moon on Instagram with my dear friend, Chris Miller. He and I went to grad school together, and we both have gone down the Taoist medicine path. So we just have kind of an informal discussion with folks every full moon. And then we also upload those onto a student portal. So if you can't make Instagram Live for whatever reason, if you go to eccourses.com, it's completely free. I just have them archived up there and kind of organized in a way that is really accessible for folks. I also do a community call every month that is on the first Wednesday of every month, and that's free as well. You just have to sign up for it. The sign up for that is eccommunitycall.com. That's an informal gathering. People just come on, they ask me questions, I coach them. Those get released as podcast episodes. I run 2 workshops. One is called Conscious Marketing, and the other one is called The Energetics of Money. Again, specifically for spiritual entrepreneurs. In both of them, what we do is we go through the yin and the yang of each of those topics. So yin meaning the energetics, the unblocking of challenges, and then the yang, which is like we actually give you tools and frameworks to work with that. In Conscious Marketing, we talk about how to market in an ethical way, in a way that's not squicky and disgusting and feels coercive. And then in Energetics of Money, we walk through a lot of energetic blocks that entrepreneurs have around money, a lot of the projections that we put on money. And then I have some experts come in, walk you through how to set up the financial end of your business. And I have a bookkeeper, I've got an accountant. They have so much experience in doing that side of it. Those are the 2 workshops. The main thing that I do is called Business Alchemist Mentorship, and that's a 9-month program. It's very comprehensive, I want to say. Go through 5 different modules that reflect the 5 different elements and seasons of Taoist medicine. And so it's really about trying to understand your business in this cyclical way instead of the linear way that so many of us are taught. All that information can be just found at empoweredcuriosity.com.
Nice. I'll make sure that I have all of that included in our show notes also for the listeners to check out. Any last thoughts or anything else that you would like to leave for the listeners?
I always get so excited when I'm on like other people's podcasts because I'm just like, oh, let me nerd out on all the things. I think the thing that I'm feeling called to just like name is that oftentimes we think about a spiritual practice as being like, I'm sitting at my meditation table on top of my lambskin rug with my candle lit. And yes, that is a part of it. And also, what happens if you bring spirituality into every aspect of your life? And that's what I'm inviting entrepreneurs to do is, can this be not just a thing that feeds you, but a massive soul learning opportunity for you? You know, it doesn't have to be business. It can be through your relationships. It can be through your communities. It can be through how you walk in the woods, how you play with your dog. I think that there's opportunities to just weave spirituality into everything, and my nerdy thing happens to be around business. For anybody else who's listening, is the invitation to make it whatever lights you up.
That's an incredible invitation, making it a way of life. That's the new world. I love it. Beautiful. Kat, I do want to thank you for being on the show. You are amazing. You're an amazing soul doing just beautiful, amazing things out there. Thank you for your work. For all the listeners out there, thank you for joining us. Until next time, remember, embrace that wild soul. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Wild Soul Gatherings Happy Hour for the Spiritually Curious. To learn more about our guests, please go to our website, wildsoulsgathering.com. We're very eager to hear from our listeners what you thought of the episode, topics you might like us to cover in the future, your thoughts on spirituality, questions you may have. Please feel free to send us an email at wildsoulsgathering@gmail.com. This is your host, Dr. Sandra Marie, sending each of you peace and love. Until we meet again, embrace your wild soul.